Thanks for having me. So I'm much more of a typical entrepreneur, and then I'm a good storyteller and much less of a PowerPoint person. So I'm not going to bore you guys with too much on the screens, and I'll do more of just sort of talking you through what it is that we do at Invest Development, why we do it, and in a lot of ways sort of where I see it going as far as our investments and our investment fund. So the first thing is just to show of hands, how many of you guys are familiar with investment funds, and you know kind of how funds work and the structure of what a fund is? About half. Okay, so I'll do some brief discussion about that, a little bit, just sort of what investment funds are, why we create investment funds, what's the point of them in the first place, and then I'll talk a little bit about how that's different when we talk about social enterprise or social entrepreneurship, because there is a distinct difference. In a lot of ways, it's not just the regions that we're investing in, but it's the type of vehicles that we create to invest. It's the reason that we're investing, and a lot of times it has to do with the most important thing, which is the returns on the investment and how we measure success as a fund, which is a really big one. So on the other show of hands, how many of you guys are really aware of what social enterprise is?
There better be a lot of hands.
Yeah. I was going to say, it is the Center for Social Entrepreneurship. So the big difference, and I'm going to say there's a lot of definitions out there. Impact investing is the space that we work in, and there's a lot of definitions about impact investing as well. Who wants to shout out real quick what you think impact investing is? Come on, someone. So there you go. It's a co-op right here. He knows.
Investing in startups or firms that are trying to make a difference in emerging markets through various technologies.
Yeah, and emerging markets is kind of a big definition, but yeah, usually when we look at impact investing, it's saying that we're investing, but we have a double bottom line or triple bottom line. And what that means is bottom line is sort of what we're trying to get back in return with that investment. So our double bottom line, a lot of times that cash is the first bottom line. That's what everybody talks about, profits, returns on investment. That's really what we're looking for, is that cash return. And then on this, the double bottom line is usually either a social or environmental return. And even people talk about triple bottom line, which means social and environmental return. In our cases, usually we're going after the social return, so you can kind of say double bottom line, but in most cases what we look at will enhance environmental, will provide environmental returns, because the poor are horrible stewards of the environment, not because they want to be or they don't care, but by necessity. And so if you can actually kind of lift people out of poverty, a lot of times you can improve the environment in doing that as well. Not always, and there's obviously a lot of debate about that. We tend to lean on the social side simply because that's where we tend to focus. And so we're looking at social returns over environmental returns a lot of times, and there's a lot of investors that are environmental first. And so they'll kind of measure that bit a little bit differently. And that's actually a big part about impact investing that's different. And we say the difference between traditional investments and impact investments is that traditional investments, it's really pretty easy to measure up what success is, what the standards are, how we do that. You just really look at that bottom line and you sit there and say, return on investments, what are the market rate returns for what I'm investing in? And then where are my returns sitting in there? And that's how I define my success. In impact investing, we have to add this whole new level, because we have to look at this and say, how do we measure social impact? And just think about what we're talking about in a lot of ways. If we say we're providing lighting to people in Africa, how do you measure that social impact? How do you come back and say that what we did actually provided a greater good to the people that was worth taking less return financially for them? And so that actually becomes a tricky area where we have to measure metrics. We have to define what metrics we're going to measure, and then we have to go back and voice that to the investors. And that's where I say it a lot of times in social entrepreneurship and in what we do, it's not so much just easily explaining this is the bottom line, this is what we've done, and this is how it is. A lot of it is about telling a story and telling what story it is and what's the impact that we've done, and kind of trying to figure out how to best display that with metrics. So telling the story, that's what I'm going to start. I'll start with telling the story first of myself and how I got to be here, and how I got to own a company and raise a fund and do all the things that we get to do, which is actually a lot of fun, and I feel privileged to be able to do this. And also, I'll tell you a story about Invest Development as a company. And Invest Development actually really, in a lot of ways, is kind of going down the map with impact investing, because we got involved with it very, very early on. And we got involved in a stage of impact investing where there was really almost no one else doing it. It was a very, very new area. And so as we've progressed over the years, we've also seen the industry kind of develop around us, which has been nice. And a good example is that when we first started the fund, this program didn't exist. And the class was like maybe 25 people. And now the center's how many?
We have about 500.
500. So that's what I think is amazing, is that that's what we're seeing in this whole field, is that when we started there was a handful of people that you could talk to about this. And now I can go and when I do presentations, they're usually pretty full houses. We do a lot of, we go to conferences now that used to be 200 people coming in from around the world, and now they're 5,000 people and they're capping it. They just don't want more people. The same thing it used to be when I would walk into a room to explain what we do to investors so that we could raise money. They would look at you with these sort of blank stares, or like, oh, this is almost like philanthropy, but I don't really get it. And now when I walk in there, they say, tell me about impact investing. They want to know more and more about it, which is actually, like I said, it's a really great sign to see that this is how it's evolved. But to go back to where I started, as Dennis mentioned, I started in, mentioned, I started at Action. Actually, even prior to Action, I worked for a long time in finance, or not a long time, but insurance and finance for a few years, even a stint out on Wall Street. So I did have an experience learning a little bit from the finance side of more traditional finance, and especially being exposed more than actually the deal flow, but a lot into the culture and what was working. And I realized early on in that part that I wanted to do something a little bit different. I had the good fortune, or maybe even the misfortune, to actually be working at an title insurance company in 2002, 2003. That was when they wrote a lot of the mortgages that ended up causing the collapse in 2007. So we had a really good view of what was happening early on, and also we had this opportunity to go into the discussions within the company of why this was happening and where it was going and the alarms that came out, and just how little no one cared because we were making money. And so that was one of those things where I saw that happen. I also had the privilege before that working for a law firm. I thought I wanted to be a lawyer, and so I went and I worked in this law firm under this special program where if you got through the law firm, you did a year, and then you got into law school, you would clerk back with the law firm, and then you'd have a job as you came out. And so this was a big law firm in Houston, Texas, and I was really excited about working there at first. And then I worked, my first case was on Enron. And Enron went belly up about 2 months in. And then the second case, I was on Anderson Consulting, which no one's heard of now. But Anderson Consulting is Accenture now, but it went belly up right afterwards, carried down by the Enron scandal. And after that, I worked for a subsidiary of Halliburton that sold asbestos. And so we defended the asbestos manufacturers. You can see the late night commercials about mesothelioma. We were the guys who discredited anybody with mesothelioma. I looked at that and I said, this is probably not a place I want to work. I enjoyed some of the work, actually, some of the intellectual bits of it were fun, but when you look back at the purpose of what am I doing, how am I making a living, do I feel good about this? And I remember sitting down with one of the partners at dinner, talking to her a little bit about the advice, and I said, I want to go do this, and I want to use this to go and start a career like in the ACLU. And she looked at me and she said, get out now. She's like, you're going to rack up so much debt in law school, you'll never be able to take that job at the ACLU, so you'll be back here just like the rest of us. And I remember thinking, like, I got to think about this really seriously, about what I want to do for my life. From there, I went to New York, eventually worked my way into insurance. I didn't have a math background, so it was actually kind of a funny story. I didn't have a lot of money, and I was living in New York trying to get by. This is right after 2000. This is right after 9/11. So the jobs were just not existent, and so I took night classes, and I took night classes in a lot of economics and finance because I had an English degree underneath. So I didn't have the background to go and do these jobs. So I took night classes, but the real story is why I took night classes was because I could load up on classes, take loans out, drop half the classes, and that's how I paid rent. So this was a point in my career where I actually looked at this and I said, I knew there was two things. I knew I didn't want to be a corporate lawyer, and I knew I didn't want to be a starving artist. And I said, there's got to be some way where I can have sort of that bit of my life where I feel good about what I'm doing, I'm passionate about what I'm doing, I'm energized by what I'm doing, yet at the same time, I'm not starving. And that was that kind of bit. Finance was something I never liked. I never really got into math. I never had this background for it. I never thought I had a background or an affinity for it. And then I started working with small businesses. And where the finance bit and the math bit really caught the bug with me was when I started to see it in practice. You started to work with small businesses like I did at Action. I started to do the books. Acción was a really great place to work because what we would do is you go into these neighborhoods that were largely immigrants. Most of these small businesses were corner stores, mom and pop shops, pizza hut, hair salons, all these kind of little, you'd imagine shoe repair guys, even women selling socks on the street. And so I said, so we'd go and we'd look at this and I'd look at these businesses, and once you saw how the businesses worked in numbers, once you understood from that point what the math was actually doing and how that math actually played out, that's when I got the bug and I realized this is fascinating stuff. It became something that you started to want to know more and more about. Once you start to build it, and you build it backwards, starting with the basic of this is how much money comes in, this is how much money comes out, and this is why. Once you start with that little bit, then you start to evolve into that, and then you can start to see where fund mechanics become. And even as we looked in the mortgage crash and all of this, and you start looking at packaging securities. We have a second fund now that's actually looking at packaging securities. And you look at this and you say, these are devices that can be used in a lot of bad ways and a lot of nefarious ways when you start to get into this. But if you really understand them, the power of what you can do with these tools when you use them for the right things is really pretty undeniable. And so that's how I kind of led from Acción. I worked in Acción. I realized the power of business and finance. I realized how important finance was in order to achieve these goals. And I realized that there was this venue that I could go and use finance, use numbers, and still do something that I could sleep with at the end of the night. I got lucky afterwards. I ended up going to graduate school, and afterwards I got lucky by finding a job at an impact investment fund, one of the very, very first, one of the catalysts of all microfinance investing, and eventually catalyst of all impact investing, a group out of Atlanta called Grey Ghost. Grey Ghost is actually a really interesting story, founded by a guy named Bob Patillo. Bob Patillo made money on two really brilliant things. One, he did real estate development, mostly building small warehouses for fast-moving goods. And then he realized that the model was shifting. He shifted into that model, made a killing, and sold that company for about $400 million. Unlike most people out there who sell a company for $400 million, of which he owned. I mean, that was money he took in from that. He went and said, I'm going to put all of this in a foundation, and I'm going to pay myself a salary. So he set up his family and his kids, obviously, but then he put the rest of it in a foundation, and he started to pay himself a salary and work for that foundation, and he started to invest that money in microfinance initially, and then eventually one of the first guys to look at this and say, we can actually take some of the models that we use for investing in Silicon Valley and taking startups, we can use that to actually catalyze entrepreneurship in emerging markets. And I got brought in there through a series of kind of random events. Got lucky enough to be there working initially on microfinance, and then when this opportunity came about to start a seed stage fund. So seed stage, who knows the stages of sort of venture capital and private equity? So let me go into that a little bit. Seed stage, I'm going to talk about seed stage investing, really big, that's a big one. And venture capital is essentially money that you kind of pull together into an investment fund, and then you invest that into early stage companies. And early stage companies is sort of a big word. It can be everything from a mom and pop, and that's usually what a garage kind of idea, college students who came up with something and now they're going to go and commercialize it, but really all they have is a business plan or some sketches on paper, that kind of thing. That's usually what we call seed stage. And then you go into growth stage or early stage, which can be that there's already revenue, the company's growing, it has a product, it's selling the product in the market, but it still quite hasn't figured out all of the mechanics of how to run the business entirely. That's early stage. And then growth stages, they got everything down, and really they just need capital in order to go to new markets. And so we invest in that early piece of this, which is the seed stage. And when I started working at Bob with Grey Ghost Ventures, we started working on that seed stage piece of it. And that means that we kind of do the craziest of all